Thank you for being here today. This hearing of the Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security Subcommittee. The committee will come to order. Today's hearing on identity theft and income tax preparation fraud is an important hearing. Especially like to welcome our witnesses. We appreciate your being here and look forward to your testimony. Joined by my colleague from Virginia, the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Bobby Scott. We're also pleased to be joined by Ranking Member Conyers, the former chairman of the committee, and Chairman Lamar Smith should be here shortly. So, and when he comes, I understand he has an opening statement. I have an opening statement, but because the speaker has called a conference for 10:30, I don't want to run out of time and have left one of you to have to come back after a recess. So I will reserve my opening statement for later and proceed. Our ranking member, Mr. Scott, I understand has a statement, and so we yield to Mr. Scott for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and in light of your statement of the time, I'll just thank you for calling the hearing. You'll recall that Representatives Cohen, Ridgell, and Thompson wrote in requesting a hearing, particularly as it pertains to more money taxes. We'll hear from our witnesses about that, and I'll reserve the balance of my time. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Scott, and we'll certainly yield later after we hear from the witnesses. Well, then at this time, does Mr. Conyers, would you care to make an opening statement?
Yes, sir, and I'll keep it brief in light of the custom of my subcommittee chairman and my distinguished ranking member. But this is an important hearing, identity theft and tax preparation fraud. Now, this is bothering apparently a lot of people, and we're glad that all of you witnesses are here for it. The message that's really getting my interest is the alert sent out by the Better Business Bureau of Western Michigan, a consumer alert about the national tax preparation company Mo Money Taxes, of which there are plenty of offices in Detroit and Michigan. Its home office is Memphis, Tennessee. Consumers are complaining that their refunds were promised in January. Some of the Mo Money offices are closed. Some don't answer their phones or return calls. Some blame the IRS. Mo Money blames the IRS. And so I'd like to hear a lot more about that. And I'll put the rest of my statement in the record, Mr. Chairman, but note that identity fraud is a $37 billion cost in America, and we think that this is worthy of this hearing. I commend my leaders on this subcommittee for dealing with this problem and ask unanimous consent to put my statement into the record.
And without objection, will be so entered, and appreciate the statement. And we have the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Smith, recognize you for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2010, a couple from Fort Worth, Texas, lost their daughter a week after she was born. That year, when they filed their tax returns, they found that someone had profited from the death of their newborn baby by fraudulently claiming their deceased daughter as a dependent. The following year, the same thing happened to some friends of the couple who also had lost a young child. In addition to dealing with their grief, these two families were forced to fight through the federal tax system to set the record straight. Unfortunately, the fraud committed against these two Texas families is not an isolated event. Tax fraud through identity theft is a rapidly growing problem in the United States. The number of these thefts has increased by approximately 300% every year since 2008. The Internal Revenue Service detected almost 1 million fake returns among the 2010 returns alone. Tax thieves victimize innocent taxpayers in a number of ways. They often file fake returns under a false name or claim someone who is no longer alive as a dependent on their own forms. Often the fraud is not detected until an individual files a legitimate tax return that is rejected by the IRS because a false return has already been filed and the refund paid. Tax return identity theft is a very real problem. Congress should do all it can to protect citizens from this crime. I'm an original co-sponsor of H.R. 4362, the Stop Identity Theft Act of 2012, along with Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. This is a bipartisan bill that strengthens criminal penalties for tax return identity thieves. H.R. 4363 adds tax return fraud to the list of predicate offenses for aggravated identity theft and expands the definition of an identity theft victim to include businesses and charitable organizations. It also improves coordination between the Justice Department and state and local law enforcement officials in order to better protect groups that are most vulnerable to tax fraud so they are not future victims. The changes to federal law proposed by H.R. 4362 are important to keep pace with this ever-increasing crime. Tax identity theft costs American families and taxpayers millions of dollars each year. We can help reduce the number of people who are victimized by this crime. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for being here as well, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. First, we have Ms. Rebecca Sparkman, serves as Director of Operations, Policy, and Support in the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Prior to this position, Ms. Sparkman served as Special Agent in charge of the IRS Washington, D.C. Field Office with the Criminal Investigation. Ms. Sparkman began her IRS career in 1987 as a student trainee in Internal Revenue Agent and student trainee special agent in Riverside, California. She became a special agent in 1988 and has served several supervisory positions, including Deputy Director of Operations, Special Agent in charge of the Atlanta Field Office, Executive Assistant to the Chief of the Criminal Investigation Division, and Counterterrorism Coordinator to the Deputy Commissioner of Services and Enforcement. Ms. Sparkman has most recently acted as the Director of Technology, Operations, Investigative Services, and the Executive Director of the Investigative and Enforcement Operations for Criminal Investigation. Ms. Sparkman holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Accounting from California Baptist University. At this time, Ms. Sparkman will recognize you for a statement, and please consider and understand that we will accept your full written statement as part of the record, but for purpose of these hearings, both members and witnesses are restricted to 5 minutes for their statement. And you can watch the lights go from green to yellow to red to let you know time's up. So thank you, Ms. Sparkman. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Chairman Gohmert, Ranking Member Mr. Scott, Mr. Conyers, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Rebecca Sparkman, and I am the Director of Operations, Policy, and Support in the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the important issues of identity theft and return preparer fraud. The work being done by the Criminal Investigation Division is a key component of the IRS's overall refund fraud strategy, which combats both identity theft and return preparer fraud. In these cases, there are at least 2 victims for each crime. The innocent person whose identity information is used to file a false return, and the U.S. Treasury when the fraudulent refund goes out the door. Both are harmed, and both must work to rectify the situation. The Criminal Investigation Division will more than double its investigative work on identity theft in 2012. We have already initiated 576 criminal cases compared to 276 for all of last year. And we have obtained over 300 indictments compared to 165 last year. This past January, the IRS conducted a coordinated enforcement sweep related to identity theft in partnership with the Justice Department's Tax Division and local U.S. Attorney's offices, which led to more than 900 criminal charges across 23 states. The Criminal Investigation Division continues to partner with federal, state, and local law enforcement, including participation by our special agents throughout the country in task forces and working groups that target tax-related identity theft crimes. About 60% of Americans use paid professionals to prepare and file their tax returns. Most return preparers provide honest service to their clients, but as in any other business, there are also some who prey on unsuspecting taxpayers. Unfortunately, unscrupulous return preparers have been known to promise guaranteed or inflated refunds, skim off part or all of the refund, hijack returns, which takes personal information of former or potential clients and files false returns when the client did not intend to file a return. And they also conspire with others in identity theft schemes because they have access and they are familiar with the IRS's filing systems. Like our casework in identity theft, cases involving return preparer fraud by the Criminal Investigation Division in 2012 is on pace to increase from that of last year. While criminal investigations and the resulting prosecutions are critical to deterring tax crimes related to identity theft and return preparer fraud, it cannot totally prevent them from occurring. The IRS must continually work to improve its processes and programs to detect and prevent these crimes. The harm that is inflicted by identity theft or return preparer fraud on innocent taxpayers is a problem that we take very seriously. The IRS has made several key improvements in a number of detection and prevention programs since 2011. We have developed new screening filters to improve our ability to spot false returns. We implemented special identity protection personal identification numbers, or PINs, for victimized taxpayers. We have launched a pilot program to aid local law enforcement in obtaining tax return data vital to their identity theft investigations. We are collaborating with software developers, banks, and other industries to better detect fraud. We have improved outreach and case resolution to assist taxpayers who have been victimized. We have deployed a return preparer initiative requiring registration for paid return preparers, as well as competency testing and continuing education. Overall, IRS programs identified and prevented the issuance of over $14 billion in fraudulent refunds in 2011, a subset of which includes identity theft and a portion of return preparer fraud. Fighting refund fraud will be an ongoing battle for the IRS, and one where we cannot afford to let up. The landscape is constantly changing as identity thieves continue to create new ways of stealing personal information to use it for illicit gain. And unscrupulous return preparers are constantly formulating new schemes to hide their fraud. At the IRS, we will continue to review our processes and policies to ensure that we are doing everything possible to minimize the incidence of fraud, help those who find themselves victimized by it, and bring to justice those who perpetrate these crimes. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee and describe the steps that the IRS is taking to combat identity theft and return preparer fraud, especially the work of the Criminal Investigation Division in these areas. And I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Parkman. We appreciate that, and there will be questions. But next, we will hear from Ms. Nina Olson. As the head of the Taxpayer Advocate Service, Ms. Nina Olson serves as an advocate for taxpayers within the IRS. Prior to her appointment as the National Taxpayer Advocate in January 2001, Ms. Olson maintained a private law practice concentrating in tax controversy representation. She was the founder and executive director of the Community Tax Law Project, the first independent low-income taxpayer clinic in the United States. From 1975 until 1991, she owned and operated Accounting, Tax, and Information Services, a tax planning and preparation firm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Ms. Olson served as the chair of both the American Bar Association Section on Taxation Low-Income Taxpayers Committee and the Pro Se Pro Bono Task Force of the ABA Section of Taxation's Court Procedure Committee. Ms. Olson graduated from Bryn Mawr College with an AB in Fine Arts. She received her JD from North Carolina Central School of Law and her Master's of Law in Taxation from the Georgetown University Law Center. Ms. Olson has served as an adjunct professor at several law schools, and we're honored and proud to have you here, Ms. Olson. We ask that you proceed with your 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today to testify about tax-related identity theft and refund fraud. Since 2004, I have written extensively about the impact of these crimes on taxpayers and tax administration, and I have worked closely with the IRS to improve its efforts to assist taxpayer victims. The IRS has adopted many of my office's recommendations and made significant progress in this area, but significant challenges also remain. I will highlight 5 points that I think deserve particular emphasis. First, I'm concerned that the federal government continues to facilitate tax-related identity theft by making public the Death Master File, a list of recently deceased individuals that includes their full name, social security number, date of birth, date of death, and the county, state, and zip code of the last address on record. There is some uncertainty about whether the Social Security Administration has the legal authority to restrict public access to DMF records in light of the Freedom of Information Act. For that reason, I strongly support legislation to restrict public access to the DMF. However, I believe the SSA has at least a reasonable basis for seeking to limit public access to the DMF, and if legislation is not enacted, I encourage SSA to act on its own. The longer we delay, the more taxpayers are harmed. Second, I'm aware that some state and local law enforcement agencies would like access to tax return information to help them combat identity theft. I have significant concerns about losing taxpayer privacy protections and believe this is an area where we need to tread carefully. But as I describe in my written statement, the IRS is piloting a procedure that would enable taxpayers to consent to the release of their returns in appropriate circumstances to these agencies. In my view, giving taxpayers a choice strikes the appropriate balance. Third, unscrupulous preparers sometimes alter taxpayers' returns by inflating income, deductions, credits, or withholding without their client's knowledge or consent, and pocket the difference between the revised refund amount and the amount expected by the taxpayer. The taxpayer learns about this fraud when the IRS contacts him or her to collect the improperly paid out refund amount. 9 years ago, IRS Chief Counsel advised the IRS that it must remove the liability from the taxpayer victims' accounts. Yet as recently as January of this year, the IRS had no procedures to make the taxpayer whole. Only yesterday did the IRS issue partial interim guidance to its employees on this matter after I personally issued taxpayer assistance orders, taxpayer advocate directives to the highest levels of the organization, and covered the issue in the annual reports to Congress and in congressional testimony. The taxpayers are the victims here, and the IRS has let them down for almost a decade. This is unacceptable. Fourth, unscrupulous tax return preparers sometimes change the routing number on a taxpayer's return in an attempt to misappropriate the direct deposit refund. When this occurs, the IRS's position is that because it paid out the refund according to the instructions it received on the return, the taxpayer's sole recourse is to pursue the matter in a civil lawsuit against the return preparer. But if the taxpayer had requested a paper refund check that was stolen, the Treasury Department could issue a replacement check after verifying the theft. I encourage Congress to modify the statute authorizing payments from the Check Forgery Insurance Fund to expressly include direct deposits and other electronic transactions. That said, I don't think the IRS needs to wait for legislation before helping these tax fraud victims. In the case of a stolen direct deposit, the IRS Chief Counsel has advised that the service is legally permitted to reissue the refund to the taxpayer, and that a return with tax data wrongfully altered by a preparer is not valid. I do not think it is too much of a stretch for the IRS to treat a return with an account number wrongfully altered by a preparer as invalid. Fifth, there is an inherent conflict between the need to protect the public fisc from refund fraud and taxpayers' expectation and need to receive their refunds quickly. We can either delay issuance of refunds until IRS has reviewed all 110 million refund returns, or we can accept that some dollars will be paid to persons committing refund fraud. Alternatively, the IRS will need considerably larger staff to enable it to review questionable returns more quickly. There is no way around these trade-offs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Well, thank you very much. We certainly appreciate your testimony and your insights. you've certainly been in a position to observe things from both sides of these issues. At this time, we will hear from Mr. Sanford Zinman, who is a CPA, president of Sanford E. Zinman CPA PC, located in White Plains, New York. Mr. Zinman started his own practice in 1983. He has been in public accounting for more than 30 years and has expertise in compilations and tax. He is a member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and the National Conference of CPA Practitioners. He serves as president of the Westchester Rockland chapter of the National Conference of CPA Practitioners and is chair of the tax committee for this organization. Mr. Zinman is a graduate of Iona College with a Master of Business Administration in Public Accounting. Mr. Zinman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. National Conference of CPA Practitioners, NCPAP, members serve them more than 500,000 businesses and individual clients. I personally regularly prepare several hundred income tax returns for clients throughout the country during any given year, and I am in the trenches with my clients discussing their tax, financial, and personal issues. The National Taxpayer Advocate's Office has reported a growth in identity theft in relation to tax refund fraud. The Identity Protection Specialization Unit, which was created by the IRS in 2008, has seen a continuous increase in number of cases reported to the IRS since the inception of the unit. In fiscal year 2009, there were a total of 80,637 cases. This increased to 184,839 cases in 2010 and 226,356 cases in 2011. This is an increase in over 280% in just 2 years. The real issue is what identity theft does to the individuals and what can be done to combat the problem. It is reasonable to presume that every American has either been personally affected by identity theft or has known someone who has been a victim. This is a good definition of an epidemic. Identity theft can destroy a person's life. It can prevent them from buying a car or a house, getting a credit card, or even having a bank account. It can hamper someone's ability to get a job. The problem of identity theft will not go away. The issue is, how can we protect our citizens in an efficient, cost-effective manner, and what is the government's role in this matter? As I prepared today's testimony, I decided to poll the NCPAP membership about their experience with identity theft. We sent an email blast Monday morning asking, have you personally or professionally experienced or witnessed identity theft situation within the past 2 years? We requested a yes or no response. Within 2 days, I received responses from in excess of 25% of our members, and more than 2/3 of the responses were yes. If I can extrapolate on this, that means that in excess of 335,000 of our clients have experienced or witnessed some form of identity theft within the past 2 years. Additionally, many of the responses included that they had witnessed several cases of identity theft. The Internal Revenue Service has for many years recognized the serious issue of identity theft and has instituted measures to combat identity theft and continues to do so. However, many of the IRS fixes can be cumbersome and time-consuming. The GAO has indicated that the quality of customer service at the IRS has declined noticeably because of budget cuts over the past year. The IRS was hit with a 2.5% budget cut in 2012, with many cuts to the enforcement and operations support. Cuts took the form of elimination of 3.1% of its full-time employees through attrition, hiring freeze, and targeted buyouts of more than 900 workers. NCPAP is a strong supporter of identity protection and has been for many years. We spearheaded the PTIN registration for tax preparers and have partnered with the IRS in the registration of all tax preparers. NCPAP has recommended that full Social Security numbers be redacted from documents which are mailed to taxpayers. We also recommend that Social Security numbers be removed from client copies of tax returns that are e-filed. Additionally, NCPAC recommends a dedicated IRS Form 14039 identity theft affidavit fax line for victims of identity theft to speed up the notification process and provide an additional level of security. We also recommend that some form of positive acknowledgments be sent to the individual within 48 hours to provide an additional level of assurance that the problem is being addressed. NCPAP also supports H.R. 4362, the Stop Identity Theft Act of 2012, and we thank Chairman Smith for being a co-sponsor. This uses Department of Justice resources with regard to tax identity theft. We agree with the concept that no one agency or department can mitigate the problem alone. The problem is too pervasive. We support the concept of the Justice Department working with the Treasury Department. We also support the concept that the federal government reach out to state governments to attack the problem of identity theft. Thank you.
Mr. Michael Robinson is a lifelong resident of the Norfolk, Virginia area, been employed by the city of Norfolk for the past 10 years, and is currently a water treatment plant operator's assistant. Mr. Robinson is here to testify today about his experience with Mo Money taxes. The witnesses' written statements of all of you, as I mentioned earlier, will be entered and be part of the record, and we appreciate your staying with the 5-minute limit. With this, yes.
Could I say a word about Mr. Robinson? He has
Yes, certainly.
made quite an effort to get here. His original transportation plans got disrupted, and he was made a yeoman's effort to get here, and we appreciate his presence.
Mr. Robertson, it's not like you don't know frustration and anxiety, and we're sorry if there's been any today in getting you here, but we appreciate your efforts. At this time, we give you 5 minutes to provide your testimony. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Robinson from the city of Norfolk. I work for the water treatment plant, Morris Bridges water treatment plant. I learned about.
Pull it a little closer to you, sir, the microphone, so that everybody can hear you clearly. Pull it up there. Thank you, sir.
I learned about Mo Money taxes through my family members, my daughter, my brother, his wife. They all filed through them. They were telling me to go to them for get extra money. So I went there to get an estimate, and when I did get an estimate, me and my wife sat down. My daughter introduced me to a guy named Red, a young gentleman that was filing taxes for Mo Money. We sat down. He got on the computer. I gave him my ID and a check stub. He did his figures on the computer. He got up, went talked to another gentleman. He came back. He gave me the estimate, turned the monitor screen towards me, and showed me that I could get back $3,602. So I looked at my wife. Me and my wife, we wasn't like, I told him we weren't going to file. I just let him know if I was satisfied, I'd get back with him later. So we got up, we left. I say after about a month later, I got my tax return from my job, the W-2s, end of January. I filed in March. I went to Jackson Hewitt, where I usually go at. I went, me and my wife sat down. Well, first I called the lady, Miss Caroline. Then we had set an appointment. Then we got our taxes done. And we signed those. We got our taxes done. But the next day, Jackson Hewitt called me. Miss Caroline called me and told me about a problem. And I was like, a problem? So I told her I'd come there after I get off work. And then when I got off work, she exposed me that I had been filed. And I was like, I didn't file. She said, you had already been filed through Mo Money taxes. I said, I didn't file with Mo Money. So she called IRS. When IRS came, she answered the phone. Miss Wade, Miss Caroline, all three was talking. We had Miss Wade on the intercom, and we were talking about what had happened. So I explained to them that I never filed, I never signed no papers. They did it without me knowing. So she was doing something, reading something, and found out in the computer that they sent me a check for $5,270. And I was like, I was in shock. And because I know I haven't received nothing. And she asked me, did I receive a check or anything? I was like, not one brown penny. So me and my wife was looking, and Miss Curlin asking me, we were signing some papers about some complaint about more money for using my name. So as we were sitting there, Ms. Wade informed me that she asked me, did I receive any money? I said, no, ma'am, I know nothing about it, never received nothing. So they opened up a little investigation of their own, Ms. Caroline, Ms. Wade, and they found out that more money had, the guy that filed my taxes named Red, he didn't use his real name. He had Tristan something on the paper that Miss Wade found out it was a female that filed instead of him. He used a Social Security number that led to being a female. When he turned the string to me, it was $3,600 for whatever he did to get it up to $5,000. The IRS sent me a check for $5,270 was different from what he showed me on the TV screen. And me and my wife, was sitting there, and the lady was like, Miss Wade told us that she gonna fax some papers, and they're gonna open up an investigation. So she faxed that to Jackson Hewitt. We signed papers. They launched the investigation, and I did a bunch of paperwork. Had the transcript from More Money Taxes that I was filed as a full-time student, college student, and that was from there.
Well, we're going to have an opportunity for questions, and appreciate your testimony, Mr. Robinson. Obviously, you've been through quite an ordeal already. I will utilize the chairman's prerogative and reserve my questioning at this time. Yield to ranking member, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Robinson, have you gotten your refund check yet?
No, sir.
You still haven't gotten your refund check?
No, I filed the amended. When I filed the amended after.
You filed with Jackson Hewitt, right?
Yes, sir.
And then they wrote back, said, well, you already filed.
Right.
Okay. And so they're still working on it, and you haven't gotten your refund?
I haven't received anything yet, but it's supposed to be coming like a 12-week span because I filed the amended.
Okay. Ms. Barkman, what is the federal government doing in response to the situation with More Money taxes that Mr. Robinson has articulated?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is a great question, and I apologize that I cannot speak directly about anything that may be ongoing, but let me do tell you that, first of all, I think it's a travesty that we have victims in these types of cases. And I do tell you that criminal investigation is actively pursuing criminal investigations to perpetrators of these types of crimes because nobody should be victimized. So we have similar cases across the country where we have actively gone after return preparers who are victimizing these victims by stealing their identity and getting the money for themselves. And we will continue to do that actively across the nation and put these people in jail. Also, for Mr. Robinson, of course, we have a victim assistance program, and he would file an affidavit. It sounds like Mr. Robinson did do that, so that we could tell that he is the true taxpayer, and so then we could make him whole on his tax return. And then the IRS marks his account so that in future years we can protect him against being further victimized by an individual that may have already victimized him before, or somebody else who may get his identification.
And what does the victim advocate do?
I'm sorry?
What is the IRS has a victim assistance program. When he files his affidavit, what do they do?
Yes, sir. So I'm from the criminal investigation, so I don't have all of the specifics, but I understand that my colleagues have an active victim assistance program where they look through and ensure to identify which is the correct return, because we do have to make sure we know who the correct taxpayer is. And once that is done, I do understand that they mark the account appropriately and make sure that the victim is made whole, that their legitimate return is filed, and that it's processed and they receive their refund. And then the information from the bad guy who filed the return is sent over so that criminal investigation can look at and see if we can work a criminal investigation on that matter, or if that individual or that unscrupulous preparer is doing it for others.
Well, if somebody cashes a fraudulent check, what happens?
If so,
And in this case, the check was cashed apparently by Mo Money.
okay.
In general, and I know you can't talk about a specific case, in general, if you catch somebody cashing a check illegally, do you just stop payment on the check, you just write it off, or do you actually pursue aggressively the criminal act?
I don't know the specifics in this case, of course, but generally it is illegal for someone to take a check that is not theirs, that they have no right to, and cash that check. And so, of course, they would be committing a crime at that point. Whether that is cashed or not, it depends on the facts and circumstances of that particular situation.
Well, I mean, do you have enough staff to actually pursue people that you have found to have illegally cashed checks?
Yes, sir, we do, because we find that many times these unscrupulous preparers have partners in their conspiracies who also cash the checks for them. And those check cashers, we would also pursue criminally for that crime.
Ms. Olson, what has been your experience when people run into these kind of problems?
As I noted in my testimony, if there's a paper check that has been forged, there is a process that the taxpayer has to submit to Treasury, to the Financial Management Service, 3 copies of their signature, checks that are with their signature, and then FMS will compare that to the check, the signature that's on the back of the check, and then they can pay out the proceeds to the taxpayer, from this special fund. But if the money went to a direct deposit account, and most of these thieves really like direct deposit, there's no procedure. The IRS says you have to go against Mo Money or whomever and try to get the money back from them.
Well, if it's a paper check, does the government take criminal action against those who are cashing the checks?
If it's a large scheme, then it will convince CI to make the referral to the Department of Justice and pursue it. If it's, a small number of people, I think it's highly unlikely because it's a very expensive thing to bring those prosecutions.
Mr. Chairman, I want to point out that Mr. Robinson went into this Mo Money taxes and felt something unscrupulous was going on and had the intelligence to just walk out and go to someone who is a legitimate preparer. So I want to thank you, and if others had done the same thing, we wouldn't have as much problem as we have now.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, and you're right, but obviously some of these people don't exude the fraudulent intent that Mr. Robinson was able to pick up, and they don't know to walk out. And even as wise as Mr. Robinson acted, obviously they still got to him. But at this time, I'd like to yield to the former chairman of the full committee, Mr. Conyers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Judge Pope. Nobody's mentioned the whole question of the Smith-Wasserman-Schultz bill about including identity theft. Is it because you don't know anything about it, or you don't think it's related to this, Ms. Olson?
In my written testimony, we thought that it was we were very supportive of it, and I do think that it is going to take a combination of approaches, and increasing the recognition both legally and publicly of identity theft as a crime is going to help. So I think that this bill is a help. However, as long as people can continue to ping our computers, something will come through, and I think it's a combination of us also developing better screens and developing better processes to help the victims to really address this crime.
There's no question that one bill alone isn't going to solve this, and you identified a number of improvements that can be made, and I congratulate you on that. Ms. Sparkman, where do you come out on the legislation that would include identity theft, like the Wasserman Schultz Chairman Smith idea?
Thank you, Mr. Conyers. Yes, I would have to work with my folks at the tax policy, at the Treasury Department, and with the IRS to look at the specific legislation. But I will say that I appreciate the support of law enforcement, and I will tell you that criminal investigation, along with bringing tax charges of false claims, for 287 false claims, we are also actively charging identity theft in these types of cases, and in fact, we are able to...
Okay, while you're at it, how many people have been prosecuted and convicted for all of this theft and false activity having to do with filing tax claims? You keep talking about it, but I don't get any numbers. Do you have them, or can you get them?
I can certainly get those for you, Mr. Conyers, if you would, if I may take that back. But I can tell you that this year alone, we've already brought 300 indictments. That those are charges.
That's good,
folks.
All right, good start. Now, what are we, Mrs. Olson and Ms. Sparkman? What are we doing about more money? We've got a witness here that's been totally ripped off. It leads me to believe that there are more around. We've got a few complaints from the Michigan Attorney General about more money. What's going on?
Congressman Conyers, my office was approached by the Illinois Attorney General's office to help them. They were taking action against Mo Money, and they wanted to be able to put information out about the services that my office could provide and how victims could get help from the IRS. And we've worked with them we're both taking cases in and trying to get those cases, such as Mr. Robinson's, straightened out. And we would offer our office's assistance to partner with any Attorney General's, state Attorney General's office, including Michigan. I can't speak about the specific cases, but my local taxpayer advocates have been seeing these kinds of patterns of behavior for several years now, and we do work closely with criminal investigation to identify them and let them know about them when we...
Got any numbers you can...
I do. I think we, to date, it's in my written testimony, but I think it's about 96 cases so far just from Illinois,
Okay.
and that's been a couple of months.
Okay, now, at the table, yards away, is a classic, this is a textbook ripoff that Michael Robinson has reported to you. Can't we get on his... I got two officials from IRS here and a classic victim. Can't we do something with Robinson immediately?
Well, this is part...
I don't want him to put him at the head of the line, but
Right.
we can't have a hearing and talk about this academically and philosophically, and here's a victim right at the table with you. What are you going to do about him?
First, after the hearing, I'm certainly going to offer my assistance, but
Okay.
my criticism of the IRS right now is his particular case. Up until yesterday, the IRS had no procedures to take that return, that's a false return, off of his account and let him file a fresh return that is his return so he can get his refund. Up until yesterday, the IRS had no procedures, even though they knew since 2003 that they were supposed to do that under the law.
Well, I know three members on this committee that are ready to call the IRS immediately after this hearing and get that corrected.
Thank you.
This is outrageous. We're talking like this is philosophy, and in real life, and I commend you for being here, and you weren't even our witness. I commend the committee for having you both here. But can we all get on this and get this in? You don't have any objection to this, do you, Ms. Sparkman?
Mr. Conyers, I will take back his information to my colleagues and to my department.
Well, that's not enough. I mean, I'm going to take it back to them. You don't have to worry about you taking it back to them, because I want to get this accomplished. I mean, they could be looking at the hearing. It's being published nationally, so taking it back to them isn't it enough? I want some action.
Congressman Conyers, I have to say in defense of my colleague that it was criminal investigation that asked Chief Counsel of IRS 4 times whether the IRS must remove that bad return. They were trying to get a solution. It's the civil side that has been dragging its feet, and I myself personally ordered the IRS for years to do this, and it was, like I say, it was only until yesterday that they complied.
Well, Olson absolves you somewhat, Sparkman, but we gotta get moving on this. This is not a play hearing or just file grievances and then we all go home and for the holiday. We gotta get going on this, and I expect you to be cooperating with Scott and Cohen, myself, and the chair as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, sir. I do have some questions, but I'm going to defer to my colleague, Mr. Cohen, and then I will wrap up the questioning.
Thank you. Appreciate it. First, I'd like to thank the chairman for calling this hearing, for all the work that Mr. Scott's done in working with me on this issue about Mo Money, which has affected so many of his constituents and mine. Mr. Robinson, your story is one similar to one I've heard in Memphis. Do you know of other people in your jurisdiction, your area, who used Mo Money and had similar type of problems?
Yes, sir. I know a lot of people that's going through, they got checks that they can't cash. They got checks.
Sir, could you, I don't know if your microphone's on or if you want to pull that a little closer as well. Thank you.
I have friends that's holding on to checks that they can't cash. People, I was like, I got nephews that had the same situation. They went to different places and been turned down because people not accepting Mo Money checks. Nowhere you could cash them. Some people checks is outdated. And
were some of the checks for, you couldn't get them cashed, and some places just wouldn't accept Mo Money checks. So did they charge large fees to cash those checks when you could get them cashed?
Yes, sir. And after they seen the news and all this going on, people just stopped taking their checks.
Did you know about the VITA program at the IRS where you could get your taxes filed without having to pay a fee? Did you know anything about that?
No, sir.
Let me ask Ms. Olson. That's a great program, and that's one of the things I think we need to come out of this. It's the VITA or the VITA program. Low and middle income taxpayers can get their returns for free instead of paying companies like Mo Money. Why didn't people not know about it? Do we not have enough money to publicize this to people and let them know that they can get their taxes done for free?
I think it's a little bit that. I think it's also that people were going to get to some of these entities to get refunds early, the refund anticipation loans, rather than having to wait to get their refunds through direct deposit or in the mail. And the IRS can't obviously loan the money to the taxpayers in advance for their refunds. That's why they go to these places, I think.
Do you or Ms. Sparkman or anybody else know, are these anticipatory loans regulated by anybody, like the Dodd-Frank tried to regulate a lot of loans? Is that part of what that regulates?
We have, in the last year and a half, we've seen a lot of activity through the bank regulators on these, and most of the banks have pulled out of the refund anticipation loan process. What we're seeing instead are these tax estimation loans, where you take your last pay stub for the year and you go into one of these places and they estimate, as with Mr. Robinson, based on the last pay stub, what they think that you're due, and they give you a loan for that amount, or maybe a percentage of the refund amount, and then they have a little form where you're supposed to check and say, I agree to come back to this return preparer and prepare and file my actual taxes. Just like with Mr. Robinson, we've seen cases where taxpayers haven't signed that form. they've gone to somewhere else to file their return, and the original, place where they've gone to get the estimation loan goes ahead and files their return based on the pay stub. They don't even have full information.
Should this type of conduct be made illegal? Should people not be allowed to use their IRS returns to, it basically, by doing that, it encourages the preparer to find ways to defraud the government to get the money for themselves.
And we also have evidence that these products increase the risk that people are claiming things on their returns that they're not titled to, so it also increases tax non-compliance.
Would that be what, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's a banking regulation issue. Who owns these kinds of loans? And I don't know the answer to that.
Mr. Zinman, you were nodding your head.
Well, I think the Mo Money tax scheme is probably the tip of the iceberg. It's one that came out. There are so many unscrupulous preparers that are signing and filing returns as self-prepared, getting refund anticipation loans or getting the money put into their accounts and not filing as registered tax preparers. NCPAP has seen a lot of that. That's why we spearheaded the PTIN registration to eliminate the tax preparers' Social Security numbers. That's why we worked very closely with the IRS to bring about the registered tax preparer issues, because we need to get the whole system, especially with the e-file system, we need to get this whole system regulated so that unscrupulous people don't do these things.
Ms. Sparkman mentioned that the registration requirement for preparers and a competency test and continuing education requirements, is that sufficient? Is the test sufficient? Should it be stronger?
It's a start. I know we've talked with David Williams in the IRS, and it's just a start. It's going to take a while before he sees whether the testing is meeting the minimum requirements. I would say it's a good start. It's a step forward rather than a step backward, and they are at least addressing this issue. I think we need to address the issues like the Mo Money type of preparers, and there are still a lot of preparers out there that are not signing returns, that are completely avoiding the law.
If I can have 30 additional seconds without objection. Thank you. Do you see any problem with a law that would require that the refund be made to the citizen and to not allow refunds to go to a third party? Would that affect legitimate folks such as yourself?
I've been wrestling with that issue for a long time, and within our organization, we've talked about all sorts of fraud that can be perpetuated and brought upon citizens. And it is an issue, it is a concern. Some of our members have advocated that a refund not be allowed to go to a bank account unless the IRS confirms the name on the bank account as well as the account number. That is being advocated by some people, and perhaps that is an alternative. Again, we have to get into the whole issue of banking regulations when we get into that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I yield back the balance of my time, which doesn't exist.
You're welcome. I have one question. There was a request for my colleagues to ask additional questions. I think that because of the time, we do have additional time to ask questions. I have one question that I'd like to present. But before I do that, I have to ask for unanimous consent that Mr. Gohmert's statement be entered into the record. I'm hearing no objection, and so ordered. My question is pretty straightforward and simple, but I'd like to start with Ms. Sparks and anyone else who would like to comment on it. It has been reported that in 2009, U.S. prisoners, United States prisoners in federal prisons in this nation collected a staggering $130 million in fraudulent tax returns, $130 million in fraudulent tax returns and refunds. I understand that in 2010, after pressure from several United States senators and IRS and the Bureau of Prisons signed a memorandum of understanding to address this growing problem. What has been the progress of this agreement and collaboration, and is there anything that Congress can do and should do to help both the IRS and BOP crack down on this criminal behavior, and being very familiar with the law enforcement segment and Bureau of Prisons, put my share of people in federal prison, I know that routinely mail coming in and mail going out is read by the authorities. How is this happening that inmates are collecting $130 million in fraudulent tax returns? Ms. Sparkman, please.
Chairman Gohmert, thank you very much for asking this question. I will tell you that one way that you can help us is to re-implement the prisoner tax compliance strategy. We had a strategy where we were able to exchange data with prisons, for state prisons and federal prisons, tax return information specific when fraudulent activity is detected. That expired in December of 2011. And it was not re-upped. It is in the 2013 budget that we have proposed that you reestablish that authority to allow us to share information back and forth with these prisons, because as you well know, when you are already in prison, another prison sentence on top of a very hefty sentence is not as much of a deterrent. And this would go a long way to reestablish this into helping us continue to exchange information in this area.
Okay. Anyone else wish to comment? You did spawn another question that I do have. Tax returns are an obvious document. It's just not a little letter put into an envelope. Have you ever discussed with or have any information from the Bureau of Prisons as to how these are getting through the system at the Bureau of Prison?
I don't have that specific information. However, I can tell you that the Bureau of Prisons does provide information to us regularly about fraud they are detecting. So they can send us information. We just need this re-implementation to share back. And so we have seen that. But remember, there are different ways to file your tax return, not only through the mail, but also electronically.
Yeah. Well, certainly I would think that the Bureau of Prisons is monitoring what's going out on electronic mail, if that's the case. So we're going to have to
Would the
pursue
gentleman from Pennsylvania yield?
Yes, sir.
Question. Thank you. Are you implying that the prison system is in on this scheme?
No.
Okay. Then can I ask you then, do you think it's being generated by outside forces, or how is this being done? It's a staggering.
Yeah, I do not know. That's why I'm asking the questions, and certainly I did not imply even. I don't know how you inferred that I thought the Bureau of Prisons was part of this. But that's not the case. I think it's simply someone in the prison an inmate has decided, well, I'm going to try this, and it worked. So
but billions of dollars. That means, I mean, are all the smart guys in the federal prisons? I mean, I don't get it, and I appreciate your candor that you don't know either. I'd never heard of this before just now. That's why I just wanted to get as much clarification as I could.
Well, we're going to try and get that clarification, and I know what the prison officers go through. I know their responsibilities, and I know the number of individuals that they have to monitor. So something is falling through the cracks here. We will find out one way or another and correct this problem. Okay. My colleague, Ranking Member Mr. Scott, has some more questions.
Thank you. Ms. Sparkman, did I understand from your previous testimony that there is a fund out of which victims like Mr. Robinson can get paid, be made whole while the investigation goes on?
I don't know of a particular fund. However, Mr. Scott, what I did say is that when victims are victimized like this, they can work with our victim assistance program, and then they can work with them so that we know who the real taxpayer is, and they can file their real return and then be able to get their refund while we are investigating, yes, the perpetrator who stole their identification.
And so this would be an avenue for victims of Mo Money taxes to become whole while the investigation goes on.
That's correct. For victims of these types of schemes, they can come to our Victims Assistance Program, and we're continuing to improve our processes and procedures and working with the taxpayer advocate.
Okay, Ms. Olson, as an advocate, have you been able to utilize that program?
Pardon?
Have you been able to help victims utilizing that program?
We are part and parcel of that program, and in most instances, these victims come to us because they have not been able to get the assistance through the Victims Assistance Unit. It takes so long, and they have economic emergencies. They will not get a refund until the account has been cleaned up, and they have proven that they are the taxpayers and not the perpetrators. And that can take months and a lot of document requests. And as I said, in Mr. Robinson's case, up until yesterday, there were no procedures to make him whole. The fund that the money is paid out of, if it's a paper check, is called the Check Forgery Insurance Fund. That's set up by statute, but the language speaks specifically about paper checks, and our counsel has said it can't be read for electronic.
Okay, so we have some work to do to see if we can conform that. And Mr. Chairman, just a word about the ID theft bill that has been referred to. One of the problems with that pending legislation is the fact that it includes mandatory minimum sentences. Mandatory minimum sentences have been studied and have been shown to disrupt normal, intelligent sentencing processes, waste the taxpayers' money, do nothing to reduce crime, violate common sense. And a recent example of a mandatory minimum is the case of Marissa Alexander in Florida, who was given 20 years mandatory minimum for firing a warning shot to ward off her abusive husband. Had she, on the other hand, just leveled the firearm, shot him, and killed him, and been charged with voluntary manslaughter, the maximum she could have been looking at was 15 years. But because of the simple-minded mandatory minimum, she had to be sentenced to 20 years, not the 15 she would have been sentenced if she had just killed him and had been charged with manslaughter. And so I would hope that in order to get some of these mandatory minimums off the books, the first thing we have to do is stop passing new ones. And so I would hope that as we continue trying to do something about ID theft, we don't make matters worse by adding to mandatory minimums. And I thank you for your generosity on the time.
Any other of my colleagues have additional questions? Mr.
Sure. Thank you, sir. I want to pick up on where Ranking Member Scott left off on mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums is in the Chairman Smith, Wasserman Schultz bill. And I know 3 people on this committee, and the chairman from Pennsylvania may make the 4th. We're all against mandatory minimums for the reasons that Ranking Member Scott just went through. Just as a matter of information, where are all of you on the mandatory minimum situation? And you're free to evade this question if you want to, because it's not directly connected to the hearing, but it's an important part of us understanding where we all stand on these matters, Ms. Sparkman.
I would definitely need to defer to my colleagues at the Department of Justice because that is in the purview of the courts. But I do think we should still continually actively investigate these crimes, and I believe that jail sentences are a deterrence. But as to the actual amount of time, I would defer to my colleagues at just the Department of Justice.
What a dodge. Okay, Ms. Olson, can you do any better?
Well, I'm going to dodge on the mandatory minimums, but let me say about, in general, the risk the risk of committing this crime needs to be increased because right now.
Yes, the sentencing.
Yes.
And that's how we take care of eliminating the mandatory minimum provision is by increasing the sentencing. But that's leaving it to the court. That's the discretion of the judge, which is, in our opinion, where these decisions ought to rest rather than on an automatic law that takes the discretion out of the court's hands.
Yes, but I'm not going to comment on mandatory minimums.
Well, now you're not with the government.
No, I am
Mr.
not. I'm
Zinman?
only a CPA. I'm not an attorney.
Right.
But I do know identity theft, tax fraud, very often is a low-risk, high-yield situation, and we've got to switch that around. We've got to do something about making this an issue that there are some real problems to face if you get caught doing this, and we need to address the real issues of where they're coming from. A lot of this stuff.
You think mandatory minimums? You think the people committing these crimes check to see if there's a mandatory minimum before they do it?
I do not think that they check to see that there is a mandatory minimum, but I think that they do believe that it is a low-risk crime.
Surely.
The low risk is whether you get caught or not. And what happens in sentencing is later on in the process. To increase the risk, you have to increase the investigation and prosecution. What happens in sentencing is further down the line, and most people calculate whether they're going to get caught or not as much what the penalty is going to be.
That's right, and that's why I'm a CPA and not an attorney.
Well, CPAs can have an opinion on the mandatory minimum.
Yeah,
you don't get excused because you're not a lawyer.
That's correct.
We invited you here maybe because you weren't a lawyer.
That's right. But and we are the CPAs. I can't speak for every one of them, but as a whole, we are the trusted professionals, and we do want the law enforced. Whatever the Congress decides, whatever the attorneys and the courts decide is the law, we'll allow that. But we do want some sort of enforcement because the e-file tax system is starting to run amok.
Sure. Well, we're talking about lengthening the time, the sentencing, increasing the period of incarceration when you're caught as a replacement to mandatory minimums. So I put you in the Dodger category with the other two witnesses.
Please, go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Let me ask Ms. Sparkman a question. In this time of budget constraints and desires by all of us to deal with the deficit, is cutting monies to the IRS and some of these across-the-board type things, is that counterproductive in that if the IRS has more money for agents and for scrutiny of returns, that the return to the United States government will be greater? The more money the IRS has to enforce its laws, will that result in greater revenues to the United States government?
Well, certainly, Mr. Cohen, more resources have more work. And I will tell you that in our 2013 budget proposal, there is a provision in there for increased resources specifically for identity theft. And those resources are in there to be across the board to help all sorts of different departments in the Internal Revenue Service attack this critical issue. And I will also tell you that even in these declining resource times, the IRS has taken steps to move our current resources into this very critical area of identity theft so that we can combat this problem with our current resources, and we have moved those resources today.
And let me ask you this. You can't comment on ongoing investigation.
That's correct.
But we know that the IRS did raid the Mo Money company in Memphis and get certain information. When a company has a name like Mo Money, which probably should have been more money than you are entitled to, shouldn't the IRS look at some companies like that and look at them before Mr. Robinson and other people are taken advantage of, and then the case comes to your attention through Mr. Scott, my office, the media, et cetera?
Mr. Cohen, I appreciate your question. Obviously, in criminal investigations, we have to look at the evidence that leads to the crime, and simply a name is not necessarily illegal to.
It's not illegal, but you don't have to have probable cause necessarily, do you, to look into something? Maybe to start to check some returns and see if they're like a pattern of behavior?
We have actively pursued and looked at many unscrupulous preparers from across the nation who appear to be doing bad things and victimizing folks like this and like Mr. Robinson.
All this money that was in this scheme was going to different banks, and they would send the money, as I understand it, the agency would be asked to send the money to UP2U, up to you, not up with Chris Hayes, but up to you, and then deposit the money in Value Bank. And then the UP2U would tell the company called TRX Alliance that the money's in the bank, and they'd go ahead and more money. There's a lot of float involved here, isn't there?
A lot of, I'm sorry?
Float, money that's just sitting there and there's interest collected by somebody. Ms. Olson, you seem to know float. You want to float with that one?
I'm just rather amazed at the scheme you've described. The IRS has filters that they use to identify patterns of return filing. And so rather than just looking at a name of an entity, what they'd look at is the data based on the returns coming in, and that will actually help us focus on here's a return preparation firm, or here's a return preparer that's associated with all these what questionable returns, and that's when we would go out and focus. And certainly some of those screens are through the Criminal Investigation Division. That's how they develop many of their cases. So it's really a data-based issue, but in the meantime, the legitimate taxpayers' returns are coming in and also being frozen, as well as these questionable ones.
Mr. Zinman, have you looked at Mo Money and other firms like this and the fees they charge people and the fees the banks charge, et cetera? Are you familiar with it?
We've seen that, yes.
And how are they compared to the fees that traditional CPAs would charge?
Interestingly, they are not a whole lot cheaper sometimes than what regular CPAs charge who don't get involved in return anticipation or advanced loans or any of these things. CPAs who perform the work and legitimate registered tax preparers who perform the work very often perform it at a reasonable fee. Jackson Hewitt performed the work for Mr. Robinson, and I would imagine it was a reasonable fee, and they prepared a correct return. So a lot of these companies or individuals who do these schemes really are not looking for the fees. They don't care about the fees. They care about the refunds and getting the money.
And then the fees that they charge for the anticipatory loans is really where
the fees, that the rates are ridiculous, yes.
Now, this has put a bad tenor over the entire industry, including your group. Is your group, which has not been part of this, doing anything to try to help either the victims of these scams or the industry to come up with higher and better standards?
We constantly work with governmental agencies. Within my testimony, written testimony, I mentioned that New York State did something this year, and I'm actually going to go up to Albany this summer and ask them what they were thinking, because on the tax return, where you send a copy of the tax return to the individual to get approval, it asks for the New York State tax return, asks for your name, address, Social Security number, and date of birth. Sort of an invitation for somebody to steal an identity. So NCPAP continuously works with governmental agencies. We work closely with the IRS. As a matter of fact, there's a NCPAP member right now at the IRS for the National Public Liaison meeting, because we constantly try to inform them of what we see going on, boots on the ground, so to speak.
Well, I want to thank once again the chairman for holding the hearing, Mr. Scott, our chairman today, and all the panelists. This is very important, because this is a ripoff both of citizens who are the most vulnerable and need these refunds and are being taken advantage of, and a ripoff of the government. And they're ripping off from both directions. And it really is hundreds of millions of dollars. If it came from the prison folks, but also in general of tax fraud costing us money that could be used to help offset the deficit. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I just have a request and a statement, and we'll bring this to a conclusion. Ms. Sparkman, could you inquire with the Bureau of Prisons the issue that we discussed about the inmates collecting refunds, and perhaps get an explanation? And I am going to do the same thing as well. Yeah. So, and when you get that information from them, would you please forward it to the committee, to the chair, and we'll compare it with the response that I get. And in conclusion, my colleagues, and I want Mr. Conyers to know that he knows that I support mandatory minimums. I'm not going to dodge the issue, sir, to a certain extent and in certain situations. And I look forward to discussing with my colleagues the issue of mandatory minimums and how we can come to an understanding. I do find it interesting, and it's an interesting concept on how eliminating mandatory minimums is going to increase the penalties. But I think that's a discussion for another day, and I want to thank my colleagues.
Just briefly, we're substituting. We're not trying to keep mandatory minimums and increase the penalties. We're trying to increase the penalties so that will be a larger deterrent, but we will be transferring that judgment to the courts and not to members of Congress.
Well, that's part of the debate. And as a prosecutor for 19 years, I see the pros and cons of each. So look forward to working with you on these issues, sir.
Thank you very much.
And I know that my colleague, Mr. Scott, cited a case, and if you'd be so kind, I would like to, if you would be able to at some point, give me the cite on that case. I'd like to look into it. Because
Marissa Alexander's case has been widely reported.
Okay.
It's particularly in light of the fact that it's in Florida.
Sure.
With all of what happens when somebody shoots somebody,
yeah.
Controversy in Florida, for her to get 20 years mandatory minimum, and we'll provide you.
Would you read? Because I'd like to read that, and I want to be part of preventing an injustice. Although I do have to add, sir, that being involved in many drug raids, it is not unusual for a shot to be fired from the drug dealer's side as a warning. So I just want to know the details, and hopefully we can eliminate situations if it's quoted.
I would say the point of eliminating the mandatory minimum is it eliminates the requirement that the judge mindlessly impose a simple-minded sentence that makes no sense. If a sentence makes sense, the judge can impose it in appropriate cases, and in fact that's what the Supreme Court said a couple of days ago with mandatory life without parole for juveniles. Didn't say that life without parole for juveniles in non-homicide cases was unconstitutional. It said that making it mandatory in all cases, whether it made sense or not, was unconstitutional. But if you're going to apply that kind of sentence, you have to look at the individual case and make sure it is appropriate.
But we know with involving minors, particularly in cases of murder, that it's a different standard by which we review it. Because of the age of the individual. And it's not that I disagree with that ruling, just it's apples and oranges compared to a 14, 15, or 16-year-old involved in a homicide and someone over the age of 18. But again, it's an issue for another day, and I want to thank my colleagues. And in closing, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today and coming in here and giving us your time and letting the American people know what's going on. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written questions for the witnesses, which we will forward and ask the witnesses to respond as promptly as they can so that their answers may be part of the record. Without objection, all members have 5 legislative days to submit any additional materials for inclusion in the record. With that, again, I thank the witnesses, my colleagues, the people visiting us, and this hearing is adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.